Well, welcome back. As good as the first part of the program is, this is the part that gets even more fun and much better because you get involved. So Sharat has a microphone and he will be walking around for questions. And again, if you intend it for a particular panelist, go ahead and point that out. Otherwise, just ask the question and I'll let them duke it out for who wants to try to answer it, okay? So, questions.
My question is mostly for the man from Appleseed, I think. The East Coast people didn't vote for Trump, so they're not included, and the Foodbank person is just too liberal. Okay. We listened to a presentation from Donna Jean Barton, Making Sense of 2016 Elections, and people here asked her, why did people vote for Trump apparently against their own self-interest? And she just threw up her hands and said, people vote against their own self-interest all the time. So if we have more voter registration, voter education, how do we get people to stop voting against their own self-interest?
Well, that's a pretty clear question.
And a very difficult one to answer. I think because it is true, you've certainly seen, at least things I've read, where you have Trump voters who are saying, I benefited from the Affordable Care Act, but I voted for Trump anyway. I knew he said he'd take it away, but I just didn't believe it. So, you know, I think that there's got to be some. I don't think on some level it's not on the individual. I think it's on people that are doing the work and people that I think are in the know, for us to somehow break through the narrative that is out there that what they're voting for is actually going to do something to help them. And getting through that narrative, I think, is a very difficult thing. But I actually think we're going to see this play out with many of the things I've seen this administration has proposed are actually going to harm directly some of the core voters that voted for him. I think people are going to have a rude awakening at that point. And on some level, maybe a little bit more open to saying, wait a minute, what happened here? Maybe I need to be more selective or think a little bit more before I vote. But it's the first part of your question was about we have more people voting. I think it's, if we lived in a country where another 25, 30% of people voted, it's very hard for me to even, know what that reality would be. But I would really wager that we would have very different candidates for office. I think we'd have different people running that may not currently be running for office. So I don't know if I really have a perfect answer to your question. How do you get people to stop voting against their interests? I think on some level we have to change the way people think about certain things, about certain programs, about what unions mean, what healthcare means. We've got to be able to get through the narrative down to, wait a minute, what does this actually do? And how would it benefit you? And I don't think that's an easy thing to do, but that's at least what comes into my mind. I don't know if others have thoughts to share.
Let me reframe it for Anita. I'll save the liberal Lincoln for last. How is this viewed on the East Coast that doesn't vote for Trump? Are we just the flyover, just the rubes? Are we just stupid? How is it viewed there?
Well, I think there were plenty of people who voted for Trump in many, in the East Coast as well, and many union members, actually, and members of my union who also voted for Trump. And so that is not something that we necessarily like to talk about, but there we have a number of Haitian members in Florida who voted for Trump. There are people, so I don't think it is uniquely a problem of the flyover states or of the Midwest. I do think that One problem is that if you have not had an experience of having any ability to change something in your life like through some kind of work that you yourself have done together with other people, the kind of organizing that we were talking about earlier, I think the idea that there is someone who has himself become successful, who can take on other successful people on your behalf, becomes much more credible. And so I do think that there is all of the kind of working people who voted for Trump imagining, well, things are so bad. Maybe someone who has been this successful in his own life, whether or not that's true, but seemingly so successful, maybe he can fix it when no one else can.
No, I appreciate that. One of the things I've been thinking about is, there have been protests and demonstrations, like when Senator Deb Fischer, that was a mess. She was down in her office and they wouldn't let people in, they wouldn't let the press in. And the comments were, I wish she'd listened to her constituents. And the truth is she is. When people say, I wish she would listen to her constituents, what you're really saying is, I wish she would listen to me. And we have to remember that, I think. And, this state voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, and a lot of smart people in this state voted for Donald Trump. And I think we have to embrace that and own that and know that this is part of the deal. It's bizarre for many of us to think that this has taken place, but it's what's taken place. So I wish she'd listened to her constituents. That doesn't cut it. That's just not, that has no reasonable argument to it. So I think we have to, go along with this. I think another thing I think about voting is in 2018, the midterm elections are really going to be a big deal in this country. And then we're going to see, is this all flying or not,
Okay. I taught in Lincoln Public Schools for 40 years, and now I'm substitute teaching. And I have seen exactly what you said, Mr. Young, with the decline. The school that I came to and taught in, I had Governor Orr's daughter, and I was just there substituting, and I was in a second grade classroom, and the little boy fell asleep, and I asked why, what was going on. He was homeless. He was living from house to house to house. So I'm seeing what you're saying. I've also just finished reading Hillbilly Elegy by Vance, and he talks about the mindset of how when the people are offered jobs, they often don't want jobs. So my question is, how can we give these people a hand up to really help them and not just a hand out and keep supporting them on the take, so to speak?
The Foodbank is currently engaged in Bridges Out of Poverty work, and that is an effort to educate the community about the lens through which we all see things. And if I'm going to go back to this, and James cited this before we began our panel discussion tonight, Nebraska is one of the top states in the country of people that are working 2 jobs. These are not somebody else. They're us. They're not looking for a handout. If I go to a food distribution and there's 150 people there, yesterday morning at Jacob's Well down on First Presbyterian, there wasn't a single person there that wanted to be in that line. And I think we need to remember that and honor that people aren't coming to the food distributions because they want to, they need to. They're working people. Everybody in Lincoln is working. Everybody in the state of Nebraska is working. A lot of underemployed people. And so, Robert Reich, we've talked about, 6 steps in his Inequality for All: raise the minimum wage, strengthen workers' voices, invest in education, reform Wall Street, fix the tax system, get big money out of politics. Piece of cake. Goddard, I expect to have this done by the end of this year. Thank you. But people are working hard. In general, people don't want handouts, and that's been our experience across the board. Anybody else?
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I think we really need to be realistic about where people are. You talk about someone working a minimum wage job or more, they are not going to have enough money to pay for health care. They're not going to have money to pay for childcare. They're certainly not going to have any health care if the changes proposed on the federal level go through. And so what is that individual to do when they don't really have, when we have decided as a society that it's okay to pay people wages that low? They are going to need support. And right now we have public programs that step in because we're allowing employers to be irresponsible, in my opinion. So I think we need to be better about giving people a real opportunity to access job training, job skills, education to advance so that they can bring themselves up. But we also have to make sure that job quality is better and that people are paid a decent wage. We're always going to have janitors. We're always going to have folks that clean our hotel or our hotels or take care of people that are ill, and those jobs need to pay, and they don't. And as long as they don't, we're going to have programs that are hopefully we'll have the programs, but programs that are stepping in to fill that gap.
Just one quick thing also from our members, even where the government isn't stepping in, anyone who has a good job these days is supporting more and more people. And we see this with our members. We did a survey of a number of our members, and they're supporting multiple adults in their family, children who have moved back home, spouses who are laid off, parents sometimes. And so that is the other thing that is happening, is the wages are too low, and there are too few people who have living wage jobs who are now stretching those living wage jobs across more and more of their family members. And so I think that is, I would say, very much agree that it just has to be higher wages.
I want to interject. It always seems to me when I hear what I think are really genuine questions that sometimes are hard to process for some of us, that I'm an educator, so when I find myself wanting to know something, I try to go out and see it. And it strikes me that's a legitimate question, and the best way to start to get an answer is to actually put yourself in the space, actually go where those people are and actually see who they are, to see how that question really resonates. And I applaud you for working in the schools and seeing the child, but you can go to some of the Appleseed programs or go to the Foodbank, and then you actually do get a human answer to the question as well. So I appreciate the legitimacy of the question, but there's so much framing that tells us the questions to ask, and they're so often not the actual right question. There are bigger questions, but thank you. I mean, I know. Yep. Is she representative of most, or is she just an idiosyncratic? And I think going and being there and seeing the more usual flow can give you a process of that. I would just say, I'm not an overly religious person, but I can read old texts, and Jesus went to the sinners. He hung out with them because then he understood where they were coming from. And I don't have to be a Christian to figure out there's something useful in that information.
Thank you for addressing these issues. I'm an interloper. I will be here for 2 years and gone come July. I'm an interim minister, but I do work with different populations and speak to people. And one of the things there are two things that I haven't heard in this as much as I would have liked to. The first is a discussion about the concept of the common good. I think we've lost the foundational understanding of the commons, and that we need each other. It troubles me. And related to that language is what I have learned listening to George Lakoff, a linguist who has analyzed the way in which language was co-opted from 50 years ago and the beginning of the Reagan administration, where they very intentionally changed the common good being supported by our taxes to tax and spend. Changed language from caring for our neighbors around healthcare, education, and everything else to the word entitlement. Pejorative terms have changed our discussion. I'd like to hear your responses, please.
I couldn't agree more on your point about the use of language, and I think that it's something that as a progressive, I think we have really failed in, and that's some of what I was trying to talk about earlier in breaking through the narrative. We've got to figure out, I think, a way to recapture some of what you're describing and speak in a way that really breaks through and appeals. And sometimes it's not apologizing for something being what it is, which I think we often do. So, I couldn't agree more. And language is extremely powerful, and that's for it, how we find ourselves where we are, I think.
I think this question about the taxation or tax, like how much of that is something that people feel, and particularly wealthy people feel, is an obligation, as opposed to, increasingly, I think you read things about extremely wealthy people feeling like their taxes are, they could do more with their tax money if they were just able to do what they thought was the most important thing to do with it, that it's somehow an undue burden that the government is taking money from them. And I've read dozens of articles like this where people are saying, oh, government is inefficient, the government, prioritizes things wrongly, and I could do that so much more efficiently. I will give money privately through philanthropy much better than the government can. And I think that's a very anti-democratic idea, that, you don't owe anything to the people around you, and I think it is really troubling. I guess, to the question just around the flat screen TV versus healthcare, I also think it's very backwards in this moment that in our country, the things that are most basic and that should be common goods are the hardest to achieve. It's almost impossible to get decent health care. It is extremely difficult to find safe housing and a good place to live. It is very difficult to achieve a good education that is affordable in any way. And those should be the kind of bedrock commons in our society, whereas consumer goods are quite easy, even for people who don't have a lot of money. It's not that hard to buy a TV or a car relative to having health care or a safe place to live or an education, which seems very backwards to me.
Several years ago, I was thinking about the Ronald Reagan and the welfare queen, that mythology he created, which exists in 2017. We cling to that like grim death. And we've all heard the food stamp users who are buying lobsters as they're checking out of the ideal market, because this is mythology is what it is. And it's fear-based. It's fear-based. I was speaking to a Moroccan professor on UNL's East Campus. We were trying to get a thing going over there, and he was married to a Scandinavian woman, and he said in her country there are no homeless people because the government, and the high taxes make sure everybody has a place to live and enough to eat. He said, in my country, in Morocco, we give alms to the poor. That's what we do. And in America, you blame the poor. And there is so much blaming of the poor. That's what that welfare queen was all about. Here's somebody we can demonize, while fat cats are stealing money by the billions from Americans. But we'd rather nag and bitch about that welfare queen and that person that's buying the lobster with their food stamps, which is nonsense. We would rather do that than look at where the real issues lie. That's my belief on that. And it's language. It is language, and we've been sold a bill of goods using language.
So so far we've talked mainly about what the underclasses could receive in the way of education or housing or whatever, or through unionization, what they could do for themselves. But what strikes me as missing from a lot of the discussion is the education of the ruling class. And I'm going to opine a little bit and then I'll ask the question. The dominant myth in the ruling class, so far as I understand it, was what Mr. Young mentioned when he talked about the recent poll that 73% said the poor didn't get out of poverty because they were lazy or they didn't care or they were taking drugs or whatever. It seems to me that in the 19th century, when England and the United States were faced with a similar kind of divide in society, you had people like Dickens, you had the social gospel people, you had people who were telling the ruling classes, you have a responsibility. The Henry Fords, a little later, you have a responsibility for the good of the whole society, for the common good, as you said over there. That mythos, that ruling classes, that wealthy people have responsibility, have full-fledged responsibilities for not just for themselves. They are not, that they have something beyond the Ayn Rand, greed is good sort of gospel. That's largely disappeared. We do not have novelists. We do not, for the most part, we do not have Henry Fords, perhaps Bill Gates a bit. We do not have a mythos that educates our ruling groups to take responsibility for the body social. And I'm wondering what your comments are on that.
I think that goes to that from stakeholders to stockholders cultural shift that American commerce made, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, was that we don't care how your workers are benefiting. We don't care, if people can afford your products. The only thing we care about is your bottom line. I know a person that works for a company, they didn't get any raises for 5 years. Then they got a meager raise, which was greatly celebrated. And a week later, it came to light that the CEO of the company, which had been in bankruptcy, she got $1 million bonus because she led the company through the bankruptcy. This is stakeholders' disregard and total stockholders' regard. That's all that is stockholders of large companies now don't care about the rest of the communities or the rest of the country. They care, how's my stock performing? And that's the pressure that CEOs feel, and that's why CEOs now are making 300 times more than their line workers. I mean, that's where we are. This is where we've devolved to, I think.
I also wonder how much it's about the kind of elite becoming global and not being tied to a place, and therefore not feeling any responsibility to the people of any place. You think about, people who have houses in maybe half a dozen major cities around the world. In which country are they actually going to feel responsible for the rest of the people living there? You think about all of the ways that real estate is being driven up in the major cities in the United States by people who are buying their second and third homes in those cities. And I do think this idea of like the Henry Ford, who are their workers and what responsibility do they feel for them? I think it's kind of an unrootedness and a kind of sense of if you're a citizen of everywhere, you don't have to be a citizen of anywhere particularly.
Let me muddy the waters on that just slightly. I suspect it's certainly true for me that if we look at our 401k retirement plans, we'll see that we are those very stockholders that Scott's talking about. It's a really naughty problem. It's naughty in that even those of us that are in the middle class are actually on the affluent side of this equation. And part of the way we're behaving is not really looking at how those investments are being made, holding accountable. Yes, we're not the big dogs, but it's still there.
But I would add to what Anita said quickly. This is a United Way and a charity problem. if you think about, many of you, lived in Lincoln in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and companies that were locally owned gave willingly or maybe begrudgingly, but they gave because they cared about this community. So many of those anchor Lincoln companies are long gone. And people in Nashville that own a company here in Lincoln, they don't give a crap what happens here in Lincoln, and I don't expect them to. But this is a huge cultural shift, and it's globalization on a smaller basis. But as companies get sucked up out of our American communities, and they're in Atlanta or Seattle or Minneapolis, that leaves us in the lurch, and our giving goes down and our corporate citizenship falls dramatically, and we shouldn't really expect anything else.
Paul's question made me think about the one speaker we had from the business college. I'm wondering what the business colleges are teaching the people who are going through them and that later on become, I don't know if they become CEOs, but they certainly become some of those people up there. And, well, I don't think they're teaching what I think is right.
So
and I don't know what you all know about that.
So what kind of business ethics are being taught and learned in the business school that you observe?
I mean, I could only speculate, honestly. I have a social work undergraduate and then went to law school from there, so I have no business training whatsoever. But I mean, my perception is it's very successful in putting out there that any sort of government intervention is always bad, that regulations are bad. The government's hand in something is bad. And that can be true for a certainty. There can be, over-regulation of certain things, but in my view, there are definitely times where the government has a very important role in doing certain things, like education, for example. So, I mean, again, I'm speculating, but I think that is part of certainly a strong thing I hear a lot is, keep the government out of the way we do business.
Well, I don't have direct insight into it, but I will tell you that we teach a kind of industrial organization, sociology. So, and we have business sociology students, and historically they would take management courses in business, but then when they would take my class and read Moral Mazes, which was actual interviews with hundreds of CEOs, they would see a very different way that managerial culture actually works, and that what they were being taught was very inconsistent with what these CEOs were describing their experience was. It wasn't my point of view one way or the other, but it was them reading those texts. So there is something different going on, but I'm not teaching in those areas, so I can't answer that.
I have a potpourri of comments rather than a question. In the last 50 years since I've been cognizant of major political campaigns, I don't recall that the lexicon from the campaign has endured this long. And it really just grates on my sensitivity to hear the words pivot, surrogate, and narrative. I feel that we are continuing to live out a campaign that maybe was not expected to win even by the people doing the campaigning, but this is what we have. And with respect to the very rich, the most elite, and those stakeholders, and those of us in the middle class who right now are doing much better in the market with our retirement accounts, we need to become responsible. We shouldn't be relying on our politicians or our elected leaders, let alone on the very wealthy to do things. It has to be us. And yes, I know that the new healthcare bill will not be enacted exactly as it's been written, let alone the first pass of the budget. But we're sitting here tonight in part because Humanities of Nebraska supports it. NPR will be gone. The Arts and Council, you name it, that's going to be gone. There are false narratives out there about the impact of Meals on Wheels, and there are very excellent scientific studies that show it makes a difference. There was a feature in the Lincoln Journal about this past week, schools being closed and the 28 community learning centers, and that those would be abolished because they're recreational, they're not educational. Childcare support, meals. I'm absolutely appalled to hear about a second grader who's homeless. I don't even want to believe that that's possible, and whether or not you think that Child Protective Services rushes in there too often, a second grader who is homeless, the family should be reported and that child should be removed to a safe haven. And I think we all need to be as outraged as some of our politicians are outraged when they give their political spiels when they're supposed to be hosting international leaders and friends of ours, and also when we go to town halls, if they're even conducted in a proper fashion. I frankly am truly disgusted, not with myself, because I think that I care and I try to get educated and I vote responsibly, but we have large individual and collective responsibility for many gaps, whether it's poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunity, lack of affording health care, and somehow I need to, and I'd urge all of you, if you have any similar outrage, to turn it into something positive.
Well, I think we got 3 people here who do that every day of their lives.
Well, I mean, I guess my first response is I agree with you. It's time, certainly, to take action. I think it's up to you what you feel is most effective, whether that's you and within your family, your neighborhood, your community. But I think it is a time to be outraged, and I think it's time to channel that into change. And I guess as difficult as it can seem right now for me to feel like we can make good things happen through our political systems that are there, through our state legislature, through Congress, and it is hard for me to think are we actually going to get something that's important here done. I still do believe that those systems can work, especially on a local level. I think our Nebraska legislature can and has done pretty good things in the past, certainly not perfect. So I agree. I think it's time to take action, and I think that there are a number of ways people can plug into different groups taking action right now. So it's certainly something I would encourage everyone to look into if that's something you feel like you want to do.
2 things. First, I feel like local action, I mean, there's a lot on a national stage to be very angry about, and I think it can feel, it makes me feel helpless and a little hopeless to be engaged at that level, whereas I think on a local level it's much more possible to be building something. And so I agree with the idea that we should be looking first immediately around us, and that the only way we will build a better politics in this country is by more local places changing the tide that way. You can see we've gotten to where we've gotten state by state, city by city, moving rightward, and there's going to have to be some kind of, I think, movement back that is not, it won't start at a national level, I don't think. I think it will start more locally and state-based. And, you know, it's not just a problem in Washington that we have for the kinds of policies that I think many of the people in this room and certainly the panelists would want to see. It's, you know, I was just hearing that in Connecticut, we're one of only 6 states where Democrats are in control of all the houses, the governor and both houses of the legislature, one of 6. And I think there are 33 where Republicans control all 3. So there is a lot of work to be done locally. So I would just reiterate that. What? Oh,
I saw a figure of 27.
okay. Yeah. So yeah. The one other thing that, just in response to your question about the business schools, is one thought about education in general is it has become so stratified, given the ways that, increasingly the people who can get higher education, there's less opportunities across the economic spectrum than there were 10, 20 years ago, not more, even as you need higher degrees for more and more kinds of decent work. And I would say that, for the kinds of people who are in business schools, what are people's backgrounds and what kind of diversity of backgrounds are there now versus maybe 50 or 60 years ago, and how does that actually affect what's taught or how people are interacting and talking to each other? And so I think that is something, I think there are a lot of people talk about education as the answer to inequality in some way, or the answer for economic opportunity. And my view is right now for working people, it's actually more of a barrier. There are things that require college degrees now that really shouldn't require college degrees. I see this in our clerical and technical unit at Yale all the time. 30, 40 years ago, nobody had a college degree to do half the jobs. Now everyone has half people have master's degrees. The jobs are the same. People got trained on the job. You wouldn't need it, but it's just used to keep people out.
The master's is the new high school diploma. Exactly. Yeah. I would echo again what I started with here. Our time is now. It's what Marge said. She's always right when she says it. And our time is now. And it's never the wrong time to do a right thing. So, one more thing. There's a drumbeat in Lincoln that our schools are spending too much. The Lincoln Public Schools are spending too much. The University of Nebraska is going through pretty significant cuts and being told, and oh, by the way, you got to get more students in here. These things don't make sense. Nebraska has a great public educational system, and if we lose it, we'll never get it back, and we'll rue the day we lose it, if we lose it. So when you hear these drum beats about we're spending too much money in our schools, don't listen, because it's the number one thing here in this community that we have going for us. And that includes the university, I think. This is my opinion now. Don't let people convince you out of fear and hate that we're spending too much on our public schools. Say it out loud and see if it sounds right. We're not.
Don't forget to include community colleges. Our system.
Well, Sherrod is getting there. There's a threshold for activism, and it's easy wherever you are politically to just ride where you are because it's comfortable until something pushes you above that threshold. And in answer to the first question, I think what we heard from our speaker, Donna Jean, was a lot of people had reached that threshold. They felt outside the system. And what people who register people to voters tell me, and what I see from Wisconsin and Michigan, is people were voting that never voted before, and they weren't really part of the process in the way we think of it normally, informed, but they had reached that threshold. And now for a lot of us, we're reaching the threshold on the backside, seeing things that we kind of take for granted, that they'll be there, and that they'll be there because people are making them happen, and then we find we may have to go out and make them continue to happen. So I think Anita made 2 points that are under-recognized: time and the risk, being able to take the risk to challenge things, and then that it isn't going to be easy. The bus boycotts didn't happen in a week. Civil rights didn't happen in a week. These were long campaigns, and they were waged by people who understood what campaigns were like because they had waged campaigns in Europe and in Japan and elsewhere in the world in World War II. They came back and they waged those campaigns in their kitchens, in their basements, in their faith-based organizations, and they just kept pushing in the face of clubs and everything else. That's the kind of courage that's unmistakably real in changing the world. And that's why I don't believe the dire predictions. I think there are other mechanisms to get there. Sherrod, who else?
As Scott mentioned about the cuts in public education and the university. What people need to really understand is like what Chuck Connors said last week, or he says in this book anyhow, that it's an investment for everyone, all the taxpayers, because nobody got where they got by themselves. They had this public education. They have sent their children to the university. And even the businesses got all these educated on taxpayer dollars from the colleges. And that helped make them what they got. And if people can't understand that they need to support this education,
So this is for the gentleman from Appleseed, but I saw that Los Angeles had their city elections, the first major post-presidential election, city elections, and they had the lowest, despite all the activism going on there, they had 12% voter turnout, the lowest in 20 years. What do you think is going to happen in Lincoln in the next couple of months and across the country? Are these postcards and pussy hats going to translate to votes?
I was not aware of that in Los Angeles. I know that there are a number of groups that are working very hard on voter registration and GOTV here in Lincoln. And I know that there are similar groups across the country. I think you have a lot of people feeling disenchanted right now with the political system, and that certainly doesn't help to get people to go to the polls if they don't feel like it's going to make a difference. I think some of what people need to see are the effect of exercising their franchise, something even small in their community that may have meant something to them, like keeping one branch of the library open, something as small as that can make people think that it actually makes a difference. So I think it's something we need to keep investing in, and I think we will see the benefit. I don't feel like I have a great prediction on what turnout is going to look like for the upcoming elections here in Lincoln. Hopefully a lot better than in LA.
James, it was a very popular Democratic Hispanic mayor running basically unopposed.
I got here a little late, so maybe you talked about it before I got here, but I haven't heard any of you talk about the importance of racism and bigotry in the destruction of our unions and in the increased inequality and the ability to harm the employees and make them less valuable.
Yeah, I think that is a good point, and we have not addressed it, and it is a very important one. I think two things. I mean, I think the idea about why people voted against their own interest, I do think that there was a lot of bigotry, which has existed in our country and in our electorate for a long time, and I do think that played a role. But I think in terms of unions, if you think about why, for example, are there not unions in the southeastern United States? It is entirely because of racism and the fact that it was in the 1930s, that was the one place that the CIO never built industrial unions, and that union organizers were race-baited, and interracial unions were baited as communist and shut down for that reason. And that happened pervasively through the 1940s, and it has had legacies up to this day. That's also true of some of the more socially progressive unions outside of the Southeast United States as well. So I think the legacies of racism, both within our unions and across them, are a significant inhibitor to progress. I will say, I think the level of organizing it takes to build a cross-class, cross-racial alliance, I feel that work every day, because that is, in fact, the work that we do in New Haven. We have cross-neighborhood cross-union, cross-racial and class alliances. And there are real things that come up every day that kind of destroy trust between people that have to be then rebuilt, person by person or neighborhood by neighborhood. And so I don't think it's an easy answer. I think it takes a lot of deep work to actually figure out how to try to work across that.
I would say one thing on the racism front, when you look at things that are put out there in Lincoln about like graduation rates, if you look at the ethnic minority graduation rates, they don't look nearly as good. And so those systemic things still exist. And when you look at any poverty numbers, if you look at the African American poverty or the Native American demographics, they're always worse. So those things still exist. There's still great disadvantage. There's a wonderful conversation going on in Lincoln and in Nebraska about white clay, which is just a hellish thing up there that the state of Nebraska is a part of on some level. Yeah. So all of these things are they have, racism has their fingerprints on all of them, I think.
I could speak volumes on racism.
We've been talking about a lot of private industry, private companies, and so forth. Government does the same things. Take the university. An example I'm familiar with is the university. We pay our service people a paltry sum. Healthcare goes up. We don't give them enough raise to cover that increase in healthcare costs. We do exactly the same thing that private industry does. We shouldn't get off scot-free.
Sure. I think that is a good point, and I think that the whole standard of what is acceptable to pay people, as we were talking about earlier, or what benefits, whether healthcare is an option or something that people have a right to, all of that, it goes across all employers, government and non-government. And I think the one thing I will say is government employers do tend to, relative to private employers, pay better benefits and better wages relative to the amount of resources they have. So with many fewer resources, actually governmental employers tend to do better than companies that have far more resources. But that said, the problems exist across all those sectors.
Managerial training is still managerial training, but one other big difference is public institutions have a level of transparency, though imperfect, that is in general much greater than the private sector does.
How do you justify what we pay our coaches?
Oh,
That's next week's lecture series.
You put that down as your suggestion for next year's winter lecture series. We certainly don't pay them as out of scale as we do our CEOs. Coaches aren't making 400 to 1. I mean, it's obscene, but it's not 400 to 1.
Making $0.
Students are clients in this case.
I'd like to ask a question maybe related to that last question. How do government employers and private employers or unions help get healthcare away from the control of private employers or places like that to where you feel so indentured you can't go anywhere else?
And that's going to be our last question.
I think it is a very hard thing to figure out what angle to take on the healthcare system because there are so many ways in which it's broken. But I mean, at this point, the idea of a single payer system, the most hopeful thing that I've heard, I will say, is that with Obamacare broken, which was the biggest compromise kind of plan that you could possibly get to. It gave the companies, like the pharmaceutical companies, the hospitals, everything, the most you could possibly get to insure people. With that compromise completely broken, maybe there will be some possibility, at least at state levels, to have some single payer come back. That is certainly what people are talking about in Connecticut. That is the only thing I can imagine in this moment. I think you would have to have the consensus around any other kind of system is breaking, as we see all around this country. And so the question is, what can you do in the kind of breach of that?
You know, as a small, we run a small business at the food bank. Our insurance is just killing us. You know, I mean, it just goes up and up and up. And so this is a thing that the healthcare thing, which these two know more about than I do, other than they're not signing checks maybe, but it is changing American business and American politics and how we do things. It is a hot mess. James, solutions?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately my position on where we are now is it's not perfect. That's what we've been discussing, of course, and we really should be working together to try and figure out how to make it better, rather than what's being proposed at this point is largely scrapping all of the changes that were made in 2010 and going to something that has similarities but is quite different, that's going to be really bad for older Americans, really bad for people in rural parts of our state, and really good for insurance companies, and includes a tax break for the highest earners. So I don't see what's been proposed as an improvement. And I guess the one thing I would say about the ACA, it allowed, as imperfect as it is, it did allow people to be a little bit more mobile with their job, that they were not totally reliant on their employer to be able to get insurance. Now you can go into a marketplace, you can get subsidies. You may have another way to get health care. So I think the ACA did make employees and workers more mobile, and I would build on. I mean, we have lost sight a lot of how successful the ACA has been. We are at the lowest uninsured rate we've ever had. We had more than 80,000 people sign up for marketplace coverage just in the last 3 months of open enrollment. I think where people are understandably upset is the first part of the title of the law, affordable. And there was not enough done within the law to try to control costs and make it something that is more affordable for small businesses and people. So I think that there are things that could be done on that front, and that's what I'd like to see Congress doing. And that's not what I'm seeing Congress doing. And one last thing I'll say about that is it's important to recognize not only is Congress trying to scrap much of the ACA, they're also trying to fundamentally alter the Medicaid program in a way that will destroy it over the long haul. And that was not part of the election. That's not what people voted about. That's something that's being added on, and it is a really huge problem, and I certainly encourage everyone here to weigh in on that with your representative. But in short, we have work to do, but let's build on success and not throw everything out.
And that was our last question. If there were an Olympic flame, I would put it out, I suppose, but I would be disinclined to put a flame out anyway. The fact that you're here, the fact that you participate in this series, the fact that you have questions and passions of interest tell me that that's precisely what we seem to be lacking. We have it, but we only talk to ourselves or the people that agree with us. And it seems to me, if we're expecting Congress or even our legislature to lead us on these issues, it isn't going to happen. They're not talking to each other very well. And if we aren't talking in a community across these positions, if we can't find that we have shared common interests, whether you want to label it common good or something else, and talk across positions so that they have to actually see people who have interests that aren't partisan, that aren't doctrinaire, that small business owners, low-income workers, whether they're in the university or in companies, a second-grade child who's homeless, these people have shared interests, and it's not necessarily partisan. And I think the work that is being done here is evidence that this kind of collective effort, this community-based discussion and solution-directed activism makes a difference, and we got to do it locally. You have to start here. It's not going to be somewhere else. And it's the only sadness for me with this series is I look every week, and we're an older crowd. And I know that there are a lot of young folks out there that are really passionate right now. They're really upset. And we need to bridge that. We need to make that communication. You have a history of understanding that they don't fully have yet, but they have the passion and the energy and the time and the commitment to wage that longer battle. And, you know, there's some really common interest there. So thank you for being part of the series. Thank you again to our organizers, Unitarian Church. See you next year. And thank you.